I never thought I'd be telling this story. Not because I was ashamed, but because I never believed anyone would truly understand the pain, fear, and resilience it took to survive it. But here I am, hoping that someone out there, someone like me, might find a sense of strength in my words. My name is Ava, and this is the story of how my life shattered at just 12 years old, only to be pieced together again in ways I never imagined. It's a story of betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, but also of resilience, unexpected kindness, and an emotional reunion that changed everything. The world as I knew it before everything fell apart. My life was simple. At least, that's how it seemed on the surface. I lived in a small, run-down apartment with my dad, James, in a forgotten corner of Detroit. Our neighborhood wasn't the safest, but it was home. The cracked sidewalks, the distant sounds of sirens at night, the flickering streetlights, it all felt normal to me. My mother had died when I was just 6, a memory blurred by time and grief. I didn't remember much about her, just fragments of laughter, the scent of vanilla on her sweater, and the soft hum of a lullaby she used to sing when I had nightmares. After she was gone, it was just me and my dad. James wasn't a bad man, not at first. He worked long hours at a local auto shop, coming home exhausted, smelling like grease and cigarette smoke. When he was sober, he was quiet, withdrawn. But when he drank, which became more frequent after Mom passed, he was unpredictable. Some nights, he'd just sit in his chair, staring at the TV without really watching. Other nights, he'd snap at me over the smallest things. The way I chewed my food, the sound of my footsteps, even the fact that I existed. But he had never laid a hand on me. Not yet. A secret too big for a 12-year-old to carry. The trouble began when I started feeling sick, morning after morning, an unbearable nausea that made me dread waking up. At first, I thought it was just a stomach bug, but as the days turned into weeks, I knew something was wrong. My body was changing in ways I didn't understand. My clothes started feeling tighter, and an unfamiliar fear settled in my chest. And then the realization hit me like a freight train. I was pregnant at 12 years old. The memory of how it happened haunted me every night, but I couldn't tell anyone. Not my teachers, not my friends, certainly not my father. The person responsible was someone I once trusted, someone who took advantage of my naivety and silence. And I carried the weight of that secret alone. I tried to hide it, wearing baggy hoodies even in the heat of summer, avoiding eye contact, and praying that somehow this nightmare would disappear. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and mine did in the worst possible way. The night that changed everything, it was late September when my father found out. He had been drinking more than usual that night, his temper already on edge from losing a job at the shop. I had made the mistake of leaving the bathroom door unlocked, and when he walked in, he saw me staring at my reflection, my hand resting on the slight swell of my stomach. At first, there was silence, a thick, suffocating silence that stretched between us. And then, his face twisted with rage. "What the hell is this?" His voice was a low growl, but I could hear the storm brewing beneath it. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Dad, Don't lie to me," he bellowed, his voice shaking the walls. "Who did this to you?" I couldn't answer. My throat felt like it was closing, my vision blurred with tears. I had spent so long convincing myself that if I just kept quiet, if I just pretended it wasn't real, everything would be okay. But now, there was no hiding. His fury erupted like a volcano. In that moment, I saw a side of him I had never seen before. He wasn't just angry, he was disgusted. Not at the person who had done this to me, but at me, as if I had brought this upon myself. "You're not my daughter," he spat, his words laced with venom. "Get out." The room spun around me. "What?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You heard me," he snarled. "Get out. You're not living under my roof like this." I begged, pleaded, tried to make him understand, but there was no reasoning with him. He grabbed my arm. yanked me toward the door, and before I could process what was happening, I was outside. The cold air bit at my skin as the door slammed shut behind me. I pounded on the door, screaming, sobbing, promising I'd be good, that I'd fix this, that I'd do whatever it took to make things right. But he never answered. 12 years old, pregnant, and homeless. Nowhere to go, I stood on the front steps for what felt like hours, hoping, praying that he would change his mind. But he never did. With no other choice, I started walking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there. I had no money, no phone, no plan. Just a backpack with a few school books and the clothes on my back. The streets of Detroit at night were nothing short of terrifying. Shadows moved in alleyways. Voices murmured from dark corners, and the occasional car slowed down just enough to make my stomach churn with dread. I walked until my legs gave out, collapsing onto a bench in a deserted park. I hugged my knees to my chest, shivering, my mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. Would I die out here? Would someone find me and hurt me even more? Would my dad ever change his mind and come looking for me? Sleep didn't come easy that night. The hunger gnawed at my stomach, and the cold seeped into my bones. But the worst part was the loneliness, the unbearable feeling that I truly had no one. Little did I know, my journey was only beginning, and years later, when I faced my father again, the reunion would be nothing like I had ever expected. The night my father kicked me out was the longest night of my life. I sat on that cold park bench, my arms wrapped around my knees, trying to hold myself together. The weight of my growing stomach was nothing compared to the weight of my reality. I was alone, completely, terrifyingly alone. The wind howled through the empty park, rustling the brittle autumn leaves around me. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the occasional honk of a car, but none of it felt real. It was like I had stepped out of my body and was watching myself from a distance, a 12-year-old girl, pregnant, abandoned, and with nowhere to go. The reality of being alone, I don't know how long I sat there before I finally forced myself to move. My stomach growled, and a deep, gnawing hunger twisted inside me. I hadn't eaten since lunch at school, and now that I thought about it, I had no idea when I'd be able to eat again. A sharp pang of fear shot through me. Where was I supposed to go? I thought about my best friend, Maddie. She was the only person who had ever made me feel normal, like I wasn't just some broken girl from a broken home. Her mom, Mrs. Taylor, was kind, so much kinder than my dad. But as quickly as the idea entered my mind, I pushed it away. What if she found out I was pregnant? What if she told the school? What if they called the cops? I couldn't risk it. I glanced around the dark streets, trying to think of somewhere safe, but the truth was, I didn't know anywhere. My world had always been small, school, home, and the few blocks in between. Now, that world had disappeared, and I was a tiny speck lost in the vast unknown. Memories of my mother as I wandered through the empty streets. My thoughts drifted to my mom. I tried to remember her voice, but it was fading. The only thing I could hear was a lullaby she used to sing, soft and soothing, a melody that felt like warmth in my chest. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word." I whispered the words to myself, my voice cracking. She had always sung it when I had nightmares or when the fighting between her and my dad got too loud. She would hold me close, stroke my hair, and promise that things would get better. But things never did. After she died, my dad unraveled. At first, it was the drinking, then the anger, and then the worst part, the emptiness. It was like he had stopped seeing me as his daughter and started seeing me as a burden, a reminder of what he had lost. Maybe that was why it was so easy for him to throw me out. Maybe he had stopped loving me a long time ago. Desperation sets and I walked for what felt like hours, the city lights glowing like ghosts in the distance. My legs ached, my stomach twisted in hunger, and exhaustion clung to me like a heavy blanket. I needed to find shelter. Eventually, I found myself outside a gas station. The neon sign buzzed above me. flickering like it might die at any second. Through the glass doors, I could see the cashier, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes. For a moment, I considered going inside, asking for help. But what would I even say? "Hi, I'm 12, pregnant and homeless. Can you help me?" No, I couldn't. Instead, I walked to the side of the building, where the bright lights didn't reach. I curled up against the cold brick wall, hugging my knees to my chest. I told myself I would just rest for a little while, just until I figured out my next move. But the exhaustion was too much. Before I knew it, my eyelids grew heavy and sleep pulled me under. A harsh awakening, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps crunching against the gravel. Panic shot through me. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. A shadowy figure loomed over me, barely visible in the dim light. "Hey, kid," a gruff voice muttered. "You all right?" I shrank back, pressing myself against the wall. My pulse pounded in my ears. My first instinct was to run, but my body was stiff and sore from the cold. The man stepped closer, and the light from the gas station sign illuminated his face. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a ragged coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His beard was scruffy, his face weathered. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, holding up his hands. "Just didn't expect to find a kid out here all alone." I didn't answer. He sighed, glancing around. "You got anywhere to go?" I hesitated. I didn't trust him, but something about the way he spoke, calm, careful, made me think he wasn't like the other men I had learned to fear. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He studied me for a moment before nodding. "All right, come on, then." I tensed. "Where?" "There's a shelter a few blocks from here," he said. "They got food, a place to sleep. It ain't much, but it's better than this." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to be careful. But I was cold, hungry, desperate, and I had nowhere else to go. Finally, I nodded. "Okay." The shelter, the walk was quiet, the streets eerily empty. I kept my distance from the man, ready to run if I needed to, but he never tried to hurt me. He just walked, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold night air. When we reached the shelter, my stomach clenched with nerves. The building was old, its brick walls covered in graffiti, but the lights inside glowed warm and welcoming. "You go on in," the man said, stopping at the entrance. I frowned. "Aren't you coming?" He shook his head. "Nah, this place is for kids like you." I just knew what it was like to have nowhere to go. Something in his voice, something broken and tired, made my chest ache. "Thank you," I murmured. He gave me a small nod before turning and disappearing into the night. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The beginning of something new. The shelter wasn't much, but it was warm. The woman at the front desk, Miss Carroll, as she introduced herself, gave me a cup of hot chocolate and led me to a small cot in a room filled with other girls around my age. Some of them were asleep. Others whispered quietly in the dark. I curled up under the blanket, letting the warmth seep into my frozen limbs. For the first time in hours, I felt safe. But even as I closed my eyes, I knew this was only the beginning. My father had thrown me away. The world had turned its back on me. But I wasn't giving up. I had a baby to protect. And one day, I would face my father again. And when that day came, he wouldn't recognize the girl he had abandoned. I woke up to the sound of distant chatter, the soft shuffle of feet against the wooden floors, and the scent of something warm, oatmeal, maybe. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The thin blanket wrapped around me felt foreign, and the low murmur of voices didn't belong to my father's drunken rants or the dull hum of the TV in our apartment. Then it all came rushing back. I wasn't home. Home didn't exist anymore. I was in a shelter for homeless kids, kicked out by the only family I had left. My stomach twisted, not just with hunger, but with the overwhelming reality of my situation. The shelter had given me a temporary place to rest. But what about tomorrow? What about next week? How long could I stay here before they found out my secret? Hiding the truth, I sat up slowly, wincing as my stiff muscles protested. The other girls in the room were already awake, some chatting quietly, others staring blankly at the walls. A girl with tight braids and tired eyes glanced at me. "You knew?" she asked. I hesitated before nodding. She didn't ask anything else, just nodded back like she understood. Maybe she did. Miss Carroll, the woman from last night, appeared in the doorway. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with silver-streaked curls and warm brown eyes that reminded me of my mother. She clapped her hands lightly. "Breakfast is ready, girls. Let's move." The thought of food made my stomach grumble. So I forced myself to get up and follow the others to the dining area. The shelter wasn't big, just a few rooms, a kitchen, and a common area. But it was warm. The long wooden table was filled with bowls of oatmeal and plates of toast. It wasn't much, but to me, it felt like a feast. I sat in the corner, keeping to myself, eating slowly even though my body screamed for more. I had to be careful. I couldn't draw attention to myself. I couldn't let them find out, because if they did, I might lose the only safe place I had left. The first threat after breakfast, Miss Carroll called me into her small office. My heart pounded as I sat in the chair across from her, my hands gripping the hem of my hoodie. "So, Ava," she said gently, "you want to tell me how you ended up here?" I swallowed hard. I didn't have anywhere else to go. She studied me for a long moment. "That much I figured, sweetheart. But shelters like this, they have rules. We need to know a little bit about the kids staying here. Do you have any family?" I hesitated. "No," her eyes softened. "What about your father?" I shook my head. "He doesn't want me." Something in her expression shifted. Understanding, sadness. I wasn't the first kid to sit in this chair with a story like mine. She exhaled. "All right, you can stay for now. But we'll need to get you enrolled in school, and I'll have to report that you're here." Panic surged through me. A report? Would that mean the police? Child services? Would they start asking questions? I forced a nod, keeping my face blank. "Okay." She smiled, but I barely saw it. My mind was spinning. I needed to be careful. If they found out I was pregnant, they might take me away. They might put me in some group home, and I'd lose any control over what happened next. I couldn't let that happen. A dangerous encounter that night. I couldn't sleep. The shelter was safe, but safety was temporary. I needed a plan, some way to take care of myself before they found out the truth. I decided to leave for a little while, just to clear my head. I slipped out the back door, the cold air stinging my skin as I stepped into the night. The streets were quieter than before, but that didn't make them less dangerous. I walked for blocks, my thoughts tangled in panic and exhaustion. I didn't even realize someone was following me until it was too late. A hand grabbed my arm. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. A man stood there, tall and thin, with hollow cheeks and wild eyes. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into my skin. "Where you headed, little girl?" he slurred, the stench of alcohol wafting from his breath. I yanked my arm back, but he didn't let go. Fear clawed up my throat. "Let me go," I snapped, trying to sound braver than I felt. He chuckled, his grip tightening. "You looking for a place to stay?" Before I could scream, someone else appeared. A blur of motion, a fist connecting with the man's jaw. The grip on my arm disappeared as my attacker stumbled backward, cursing. I turned and saw my savior. It was the man from last night, the one who had led me to the shelter. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice steady. I nodded, my body trembling. The drunk man scowled, but he didn't fight back. He just spat on the ground before staggering off into the darkness. I exhaled shakily. "Thank you." The man nodded, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. "What are you doing out here?" I looked away, thinking. He sighed. Bad idea in a place like this. Come on, let's get you back before you do something stupid. I hesitated, then fell into step beside him. I still didn't know his name. I still didn't know if I could trust him, but he had saved me twice now. And in a world that had abandoned me, that meant something. The beginning of a plan by the time I got back to the shelter. My mind was made up. I couldn't stay here forever. I couldn't wait for people to figure out my secret and take control of my life. I needed to leave for good. I just didn't know where I was going yet. But one thing was certain. I would never let my father's abandonment define me. I would survive. And one day, I would face him again. Only this time, I wouldn't be the scared little girl he had thrown away. The morning after my encounter with the drunk man, I woke up to a sharp pain in my stomach. For a terrifying second, I thought something was wrong with the baby. I sat up quickly, clutching my belly, but the pain faded to a dull ache. Hunger, I let out a shaky breath. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way. Food wasn't something I had access to regularly. And now that I was eating more consistently at the shelter, my body was demanding what it had been missing. I forced myself to stand, ignoring the dizziness that followed, and headed to the common area. The other girls were already gathered for breakfast, and I took a seat near the end of the table. As I reached for a piece of toast, I noticed a girl with the tight braids from the night before watching me. Her gaze flickered to my stomach. I froze. Had she noticed? She leaned in slightly. You all right? I swallowed hard. Yeah, just tired. She didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded. I'm Nina. Ava. She took a bite of her toast, chewing slowly. You've been out here long. I hesitated before shaking my head. Not really. She hummed, as if she didn't believe me. Most girls that come through here don't last. Either they get placed somewhere, or they disappear. Disappear. The word sent a chill down my spine. I knew what she meant. Some girls ran away. Others weren't so lucky. I lowered my head and focused on my food, but my mind was racing. How long did I have before someone figured me out? The thread of discovery Miss Carroll's voice broke through my thoughts. Ava, can I see you in my office? Every muscle in my body tensed. Had she found out? I wiped my hands on my hoodie and followed her, forcing my breathing to stay steady. As we entered her small office, I saw a file sitting on her desk. I spoke with a social worker this morning, she said, her voice gentle but firm. They'll be coming by to talk to you. My stomach dropped. They want to check if there are any relatives who can take you in, she continued. If not, they'll look into placing you in foster care. Foster care. I knew what happened in foster care. Not every family was kind. Not every home was safe. And if they found out I was pregnant, they might separate me from my baby. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my expression blank. I don't have any family. Miss Carroll sighed. Ava, you're 12. Someone has to be looking for you. No one was. No one ever would. I'll talk to them, I said quickly, but I'm not going back. Her eyes softened, but she didn't push. We'll figure something out. I nodded, but deep down, I knew the truth. I couldn't stay here much longer. A dangerous proposition that night. As I lay on my cot, Nina's voice whispered through the darkness. I know a way out. I turned my head toward her. What? She shifted, her voice barely audible. You don't want to go into the system, right? I swallowed. No, there's a guy, she said carefully. Helps girls like us. Gets them off the streets. Gives them a place to stay. A sick feeling curled in my gut. I didn't like where this was going. What's the catch? Nina hesitated. He asked for favors. I tensed. I knew what that meant. I had seen the older girls hanging around outside liquor stores, getting into cars with strange men. No, I said immediately. Nina sighed. It's not like that. Not always. Sometimes he just wants errands done. If you're lucky, I shook my head. I'm not that desperate. She didn't push, but her words stuck with me, because deep down, I knew that if I didn't figure something out soon, desperation might not be a choice. An unexpected betrayal the next day. I was in the common area when I noticed Miss Carroll talking to someone near the entrance. A woman in a gray suit, holding a clipboard. The social worker. Panic shot through me. I had to get out now. I stood quickly, my heart pounding, and turned to head for the back door. And that's when I saw Nina. She was watching me, arms crossed, and the look in her eyes told me everything. She had told them. My chest tightened. Why? I whispered. Her expression didn't change. Because you're stupid if you think you can do this alone. Miss Carroll turned, spotting me. Ava, can you come here for a minute? I didn't have a choice. Running out of time, I sat across from the social worker, my hands curled into fists in my lap. She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Ava, we just want to help. Can you tell me where your father is? I stared at the floor. I don't know. Her pen scratched against the paper. Do you know any other family members who can take you in? No, she sighed. You're very young to be on your own. We need to make sure you're safe. I forced myself to look up. I am safe. Her gaze flickered with something. Doubt, maybe sympathy. You've been through a lot. I can't imagine how hard it's been, but we need to find a more permanent solution. I said nothing. She closed her file. We'll be back in a few days to check in. My blood ran cold. A few days. That was all the time I had left. The last option that night. I sat on my cot, staring at the ceiling. I had two choices. Stay and risk being put into foster care, where they might take my baby away. Or leave, with no money, no home, and no idea where to go. Neither option felt like survival, but one of them meant I'd still have control. I made my decision. Before dawn, I would leave the shelter for good. I would disappear. And no one, not my father, not the social worker, not even Nina, ever find me again. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind raced with the same question. Where will I go? Leaving the shelter was a risk, but staying was worse. If social services got involved, they'd place me somewhere safe, which probably meant foster care. I had read stories. Some foster homes were kind, but others were nightmares. And even if I got lucky, what happened when they found out about my pregnancy? Would they take my baby from me? I couldn't let that happen. As the sky turned from black to a dull gray, I sat up and quietly gathered my few belongings. An extra sweater, a bottle of water, and the crumpled $5 bill I had found on the street a few days ago. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I glanced at Nina, sleeping in the cot across from me. I still couldn't believe she had told Miss Carroll about me. She thought she was helping, but she had no idea what I was running from. I took one last look around the room. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I slipped out the door and into the cold morning air. Nowhere to go, the streets were quieter than usual, the city still waking up. I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in my stomach. I needed a plan. Shelters wouldn't take me in again, not without paperwork. The only people who might help were dangerous, the kind Nina had warned me about. I could already hear her voice in my head. You think you're better than the rest of us? We all survived the same way. I shook the thought away. There has to be another way. I wandered for hours, keeping my head down, my steps slow and careful. By midday, exhaustion was setting in. My body was weaker than before, my pregnancy draining what little strength I had left. I found an alleyway near the back of a convenience store and slid down against a cold brick wall. My feet ached, my stomach twisted with hunger, and my hands trembled from the biting wind. I needed a miracle. An unwanted offer. Didn't expect to see you out here. I stiffened. That voice. I looked up and saw him. The man who had helped me that night outside the shelter. the one who had punched the drunk who grabbed me. He leaned against the alley wall, hands in his coat pockets, studying me with an unreadable expression. "You're running," he said, more as a statement than a question. I didn't answer. He let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, I thought so. You kids always think you can do it alone." I glared at him. "I'm not a kid." His smirk faded slightly. "You sure about that?" Silence stretched between us. Then he sighed and crouched down so we were at eye level. "Look," he said, "I don't know what you're running from, but I know you're not going to last long out here. You're already struggling." I hated that he was right. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's a guy a few blocks from here. Helps people like you." No questions asked. I took the paper cautiously. It had an address scribbled on it. Nothing else. "What's the catch?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nothing's free, kid, but it's safer than the streets." My grip on the paper tightened. "Safer? But at what cost?" He stood up. "Think fast. It's only going to get colder." Then he walked away, leaving me alone with a choice I didn't want to make. A moment of weakness. I stayed in the alley until my body couldn't take it anymore. Hunger, exhaustion, the weight of everything. I couldn't fight it. My vision blurred as I tried to stand. My legs gave out, and the world spun around me. Then, everything went black. The last person I expected when I woke up, I wasn't in the alley anymore. A warm blanket covered me. The scent of coffee and something sweet filled the air. I blinked against the light and realized I was in a small apartment. A couch, a tiny kitchen, a table with a plate of food on it. And sitting across from me, watching carefully, was the last person I ever expected. "Nina, you really are stupid," she muttered, shaking her head. I sat up too fast, dizziness slamming into me. Where am I?" "My brother's place," she said. "I found you passed out near the store. Thought you were dead for a second." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Why did you help me?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Because I knew you'd do something reckless. And because I don't hate you, no matter how much you think I do." I looked away, guilt creeping in. I can't go back to the shelter. I know. Silence hung between us. Then quietly she said, "So what's the plan, Ava?" "You can't run forever." I didn't have an answer, because for the first time since my father kicked me out, I had nowhere left to run. The room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside. I could feel Nina watching me, waiting for an answer I didn't have. "So, what's the plan, Ava?" she asked again. I swallowed hard. I had been running for so long, surviving on instinct alone. Now, sitting here in her brother's apartment, wrapped in a warm blanket, I realized something terrifying. I had no plan. I stared at the floor, my hands tightening into fists. "I don't know," I admitted. Nina sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "Look, I get it. You don't trust the system. You don't trust anyone. But you can't keep doing this." I didn't respond. She pushed back her chair, standing up. "You need food and a real doctor, Ava. Have you even been checked since you know?" My stomach clenched. The truth was, I had no idea if my baby was okay. I felt it growing inside me, but that was all. Nina softened slightly. "My brother can help. He knows people." That set off alarm bells in my head. "What kind of people?" She hesitated. "Not the kind you want to owe favors to, but they can get you what you need." I shook my head. "No, I can't risk that." Nina let out a frustrated breath. "Then what? What's your genius plan, Ava? You gonna go back to sleeping in alleys? Get picked up by some creep? You won't last out there." Her voice cracked at the end, surprising both of us. I met her eyes. For the first time, I saw something real in them. Not just frustration, but something deeper. Worry. For me. I looked away. "I'll figure it out." She shook her head. "You're impossible." She grabbed her coat and headed toward the door. Stay here. Don't do anything stupid." Then she was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Nowhere left to hide. Hours passed. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, trying to think. I needed a real way out. Not another night on the streets. Not another close call. I thought about Miss Carroll, about the social worker who was probably still looking for me. If I went back to the system, they'd decide my future for me. Foster care, separation from my baby. I thought about my father. The man who would throw me out like I was nothing. Did he ever wonder what happened to me? Did he even care? A sudden knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts. I froze. Nina had a key. She wouldn't knock. I stood slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Another knock, louder this time. Then a voice I hadn't heard in months. "Ava, are you in there?" My breath caught in my throat. Miss Carroll. The breaking point, I backed away from the door, panic flooding my veins. How had she found me? Had Nina told her? "Ava, please." Miss Carroll called through the door. "I just want to talk." I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "I'm not going back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause. Then, softer, "I know you're scared, but you don't have to do this alone." My hands clenched at my sides. "Alone is all I've ever been. I can help you," she continued, "but you have to let me." Tears burned my eyes. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust someone. But trust had never gotten me anywhere. I took another step back, and then I heard the second voice, one that made my entire body go cold. "Ava." It was deeper, rougher than I remembered, but I knew it instantly. My father, a past that refuses to stay, buried. My knees nearly gave out. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. "No, no, this isn't happening. I know you're in there," he said. "Just come out and talk." Terror crashed over me like a tidal wave. Why was he here? Miss Carroll's voice came next. "Ava, I wouldn't have brought him if I didn't think he deserved a chance to explain." Explain? What was there to explain? He had thrown me out, his own daughter. He hadn't cared if I lived or died. I felt my body shaking. Nina's words from earlier came back to me. "You can't run forever." Maybe she was right, but I wasn't ready for this. Not yet. The escape, I made my decision in an instant. I grabbed my hoodie, shoved my feet into my shoes, and moved toward the window. Nina's brother's apartment was on the second floor, but there was a fire escape outside. Miss Carroll knocked again. "Ava, please." I ignored her. I unlatched the window and pushed it open, my heart hammering. The metal of the fire escape was cold against my hands as I climbed through. Then, just as I started down the ladder, "Ava," I whipped my head around. My father was standing in the doorway of the apartment, his face pale, his eyes wide. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I did the only thing I knew how to do. I ran. The cold air stung my face as I bolted down the fire escape, my hands gripping the icy metal rails. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, shouting my name, calling for me to stop. I didn't stop. I hit the pavement and kept going, weaving through the back streets, my legs moving on pure adrenaline. My mind screamed, "Run, run, run." But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't outrun the past. Nowhere left to run. I finally slowed near an abandoned lot, my breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. My stomach ached, a sharp cramp tearing through my side. I pressed a hand to my belly, trying to calm both myself and the tiny life growing inside me. I had nowhere left to go. Nina had found me once. Miss Carroll had found me. And now my father had, too. I sank to the ground, pressing my back against a crumbling brick wall. Tears burned my eyes. Why now? Why did he come back after all this time? I thought about the last time I saw him. his face twisted in disgust as he threw my things onto the porch, his voice cold and final. "You're not my daughter anymore." The pain of that night still sat in my chest, heavy and unmoving. A voice from the past footsteps. I tensed, ready to run again. But when I looked up, it wasn't a stranger standing there. It was Miss Carroll. She wasn't out of breath. She hadn't chased me. She had simply followed. Knowing I'd stop eventually, she stepped closer, hands up like she was approaching a wounded animal. "Ava," she said softly, "it's okay." I shook my head, wiping at my tears. "No, it's not." She didn't argue. Instead, she sat down next to me, resting her back against the same wall. We sat in silence for a moment, the city noise humming around us. Then, finally, she spoke. "Your father's been looking for you." My stomach twisted. Why? He made it clear I wasn't his problem. Miss Carroll sighed. "People make terrible mistakes, Ava. Some they regret too late. Some they try to fix, even when they don't deserve a second chance." I scoffed. "So now he wants to fix things." "He's not asking for your forgiveness," she said. "He just wants to talk." I hugged my knees to my chest, my throat tight. "I don't want to see him." She nodded. "That's your choice. No one's forcing you." Silence stretched between us again. Then, after a long pause, I whispered, "What does he want to say?" The truth, I never knew Miss Carroll hesitated. Then she pulled something from her pocket, a folded piece of paper. "He wrote you a letter," she said, "in case you wouldn't talk to him." I stared at it, my hands trembling. I didn't want to take it. I didn't want his words, his excuses. But at the same time, I had spent every night since he threw me out wondering why. Why he stopped loving me. Why I wasn't enough. Slowly, I reached for the letter. Miss Carroll gave it to me, then stood up. "I'll be nearby if you need me." Then she walked away, leaving me alone with the past. A father's words, I unfolded the letter, my breath shaky. "Ava, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't deserve for you to. I don't have excuses for what I did. I was angry, scared. I thought throwing you out would somehow erase what happened, but it didn't. Every day, I've woken up wondering if you were safe, if you had enough to eat, if someone was helping you when I didn't. I was wrong, Ava, and I'm sorry. I can't change what I did, but if you'll let me, I want to try be your father again. Not because I deserve it, but because I love you, even if I didn't show it when it mattered most." Dad, I stared at the letter, my hands shaking. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I had spent months telling myself I didn't care, that I hated him, that I never wanted to see him again. But the truth was, I wanted him to come for me. I had wanted him to regret it. And now that he had, I didn't know what to do. A choice to make a shadow fell over me. I looked up. My father stood a few feet away, his face unreadable, his eyes searching mine. I could see it now, what I hadn't seen the night he threw me out. Guilt, regret, love, buried beneath all the damage. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like he didn't know where to start. Neither did I. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't run. I sat there, gripping his letter in my hands, and waited for him to speak. The night air was thick with silence. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional gust of wind sweeping through the alley. I sat there, gripping my father's letter, feeling its weight press into my hands as if it held the power to rewrite the past. And yet, nothing could erase what had happened. I looked up at him. He stood a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his face a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Something hesitant, like he was afraid to move too fast and scare me away. I should have said something, anything, but my voice felt locked behind a wall of emotions too heavy to push past. So he spoke first. "Ava," he said softly, his voice rough, tired. He stopped, shaking his head, then tried again. "I don't know where to start." I swallowed hard. You could start with why. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. Because I was a coward. The answer surprised me. He continued, his voice thick with regret. When your mother died, I had no idea how to raise you alone. And then I found out you were pregnant, and I panicked. I let anger make the decision for me. I clenched my jaw. So, what? You just threw me out? Like I was nothing. He flinched. No, I threw you out because I was weak, because I was scared, and because I was too much of a fool to see what really mattered. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped me. It took you this long to figure that out? His shoulders slumped. No, I knew the moment I shut the door on you, and I've regretted it every second since. I wanted to believe him. A part of me longed to. But another part, the part that had spent nights sleeping on cold sidewalks, the part that had gone hungry more times than I could count, the part that had learned how to survive alone, wasn't ready to forgive so easily. You don't just get to show up now and fix things, I said, my voice sharp. That's not how it works. He nodded. I know. Silence stretched between us. Then he looked at my stomach. His eyes darkened with emotion. Is a baby okay? I hesitated, then gave a small nod. As far as I know. Something in his expression cracked. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a moment, I thought I saw tears in his eyes. I should have been there. I felt my own tears rising. Yeah, you should have. A broken man's apology. Miss Carroll had kept her distance, standing near the entrance of the alley, giving us space. I could feel her presence, steady, like an anchor keeping me grounded. My father took a deep breath. I'm not here to make excuses. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I had to find you, Ava. I had to tell you that I was wrong. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was lying, that this was just another cruel twist in my already shattered life. But I didn't find one. Instead, I saw something I had never seen in my father before. Vulnerability. This wasn't the same man who had thrown me out. This was someone else. Someone who had spent months haunted by regret. But did that change anything? I looked away, my mind a storm of emotions. I don't know what you want from me, I said finally. Do you think you can just apologize and everything will go back to normal? No, he admitted. I just want a chance to be in your life again, to help, to try and make things right. I let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can trust you. His voice cracked. I don't blame you. The weight of the past, we stood there, lost in the wreckage of what used to be our family. I thought back to the father I had known before my mother died, the one who used to tuck me in at night, who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street, the one who used to love me. Was there any part of him left? I didn't know, and that terrified me. Miss Carroll finally stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Ava, you don't have to decide anything right now. No one is forcing you to forgive, but you deserve support. You deserve love. And if he's truly here to give it, maybe that's worth considering. I bit my lip, my hands tightening around the letter. Could I take that risk? After everything I had been through, could I really let him back in? The answer wasn't simple, and maybe it never would be. But for the first time, I wasn't running. For the first time, I was standing still. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days that followed that night were anything but easy. In fact, the hardest part wasn't the reunion itself. It was what came after. There's a myth that when people apologize and you finally confront the past, everything magically falls into place. But in reality, healing isn't a neat, linear process. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and it takes time. The first thing I did was set boundaries. My father's sudden desire to make things right was overwhelming, and I wasn't ready to let him back into my life just yet. But that didn't mean I closed the door completely. I knew deep down that this wasn't something I could fix overnight. So I let him visit every few days, just to check in. He brought food, asked how I was doing, but always kept a respectful distance, never pushing me to forgive him. I needed space to breathe, to think. During this time, I found myself turning to Miss Carol more than I had before. She became my safe haven, the one person who never judged me, who never made me feel like I had to prove myself. One afternoon, as I sat with Miss Carol on her porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, she turned to me and asked, "How are you holding up, Ava?" I thought about it for a moment. I'm not sure. Everything feels like it's shifting, like I'm stuck in between who I was and who I need to become. Miss Carol nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. That's normal. Change doesn't happen overnight. But what you're doing, Ava, that's progress. I smiled weakly. It doesn't feel like progress. It's okay to feel that way. Healing isn't always a straight line. She was right. And even though the pain of the past hadn't disappeared, I could feel the weight of it lightening just a little. The conversation that changed everything a week later, I agreed to meet my father again. We sat in a small park near the apartment, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees. There was a tense stillness in the air, but there was also something else, something fragile and uncertain, like two people unsure of how to begin again. He didn't speak first this time. Instead, he handed me a small, carefully wrapped gift. "What's this?" I asked, staring at the neatly wrapped box. He gave a sheepish smile. "It's for the baby." I hesitated, then accepted the gift. When I opened it, I found a soft hand-knitted blanket. Perfectly small, soft, and gentle. I ran my fingers over the threads, feeling the care in every stitch. "Why?" I asked quietly, my voice a mixture of surprise and confusion. "After everything, why are you doing this?" He looked down, avoiding my eyes. "Because I know I messed up. I know I can't erase the hurt I caused. But this is a start. I want to be a part of your life, Ava. I want to be here for you and the baby." I looked at him, seeing a man I didn't recognize. A man who was trying, however imperfectly, to do what was right. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," I whispered. He nodded, a look of deep sorrow on his face. "I understand, but I want you to know I'm here. When you're ready, I'll be here." For the first time, I realized that it wasn't about whether or not he could fix the past. It was about whether I could find a way to move forward. Taking the first step, the weeks that followed were filled with moments of quiet healing. I began to let my guard down little by little. I allowed my father to be a part of my life again, though cautiously. He helped me with the baby's preparations, and I allowed him to show me that he was capable of caring in ways he hadn't before. And while it didn't erase the pain, it helped me begin to rebuild trust. I started going to therapy. It was something Miss Carol had suggested, and at first, I'd been hesitant. But I realized it was something I needed. I couldn't carry the weight of the past on my own any longer. In therapy, I confronted things I had buried for so long. The shame, the fear, the anger. And as I worked through it, I began to see that forgiveness wasn't just for him. It was for me, too. I didn't have to forget what he had done, but I also didn't need to carry the burden of that pain with me forever. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing his actions. It meant freeing myself from the grip of that resentment. It wasn't easy. Some days, I wanted to shut everyone out. But the more I allowed myself to heal, the more I realized that I was becoming stronger, not weaker, by facing the truth. The baby arrives months later. I gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby boy. It was the hardest and most beautiful thing I had ever done. As I held him in my arms, I couldn't help but think about the future. The future I had to build, not just for me, but for him too. My father was there, standing beside me in the hospital room. He wasn't perfect, and I wasn't sure if we'd ever fully repair what had been broken between us. But he was trying, and I was trying too. When he held his grandson for the first time, I saw a tear slip down his cheek. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "You're here," I replied softly. "That's enough for now." A new beginning as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for the future. Hope for my family. Hope for myself. I had spent so many years running from my past, from the pain that defined me, that I hadn't allowed myself the space to grow. But now, with the love of a child and the tentative steps of a father trying to be better, I could see a new path unfolding before me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and I wasn't doing it alone. Epilogue, as I looked down at my baby boy, my heart swelled with love. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but I also knew I wasn't the same scared 12-year-old girl who had been thrown out into the world. I had learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, but it did mean giving myself permission to move forward. And that was the most important lesson I could pass on to my son. We could break, but we could also rebuild. And I was ready to build something new, a family, a future, and a life full of love.